Okay, we're now going to jump ahead to just a little bit to after the Civil War, all right? We're talking about the late 1800s, early 1900s in Texas. The Teeks list a lot of stuff. To me, a bunch of random things, a bunch of random people, not to say they're not important people, but sometimes it's hard to see the connections between all those people. A bunch of random events. I don't think you're going to get asked about most of that stuff. I do think that you'll get asked, probably, if you get asked the question about this, that it'll be about one of three things. And it's going to be about the cattle industry, it's going to be about the oil industry, and relations with Native Americans. I think those are the three issues that you should remember. And that's what we're going to focus on in here. Okay? So we're going to focus first on cattle and the cattle industry. On the cattle industry. Now, you've seen probably, I know I've seen, maybe you've seen, but cattle drives, right? You've seen cattle drives on movies and TV, and it's really iconic, right? There's this kind of mythology about it. And it seems like cattle drives lasted for a long time in Texas, but they didn't. They lasted maybe 30 years, 40 years at the outside, but probably 30 years. So we're really talking about after the Civil War, let's say 1866 to let's say 1896, okay? It was just before 1900, in the 1890s, when cattle drives stopped, right? So how did they start? Well, during the Civil War, there was a blockade, right, of the South by the Union Navy, okay? So cattle weren't getting sold. Beef was not getting sold outside of Texas, okay? And it wasn't getting shipped to other countries. It wasn't getting shipped to markets in the North because the North wasn't buying cattle, right? They weren't buying beef from the South. So for several years, for those 4 or 5 years, for several years, Longhorns cattle just roamed freely across Texas, right? This was largely uninhabited, at least by white people, by settlers, right? I mean, there were Native Americans here, of course, but towns and things like that, and there weren't fences, you know, so it was kind of open country. We're talking about Panhandle down to South Texas, not over here, Big Bend, not there, not here in the piney woods and the forest in East Texas, but this area, right here in the middle of the state, down to the southern part of the state. Cattle just roamed freely for those few years, right? Because they couldn't export them. Well, after the Civil War ended, there was this demand for beef, for Texas beef. So some entrepreneurs, some enterprising cattle people, mostly cattlemen. There's one famous cattle woman. We'll put her name down in a moment. They rounded them up. Literally just went around and found all the feral, the wild cattle, rounded them up, and took them to market, okay? But the markets were north. They had to drive that cattle. There were no railroads. There were no cars. There were no buses. There were no trucks. Anyway, to get those cattle up to Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, up north, right, where the railroads were, okay? So that's where the cattle drives came from. People hired cowboys, mainly men, not all men, some women, to drive cattle north. That's where the cattle drives came from, okay? There were two big names, right? Well, three big names, okay? Three in the teach, and one we should know is Charles Goodnight. Right? A cattle trail. There's a map on your handout, an image rather. It shows where some of these are. That was kind of, well, I don't remember. One of them was this way. One of them kind of went like that, and there were a couple others. Which one was the Chisholm? Which one was the Goodnight Loving Trail? Forgetting right now. But anyway, the Goodnight Loving Trail was a cattle trail. He was a famous cattleman, and had a cattle trail named after him. That's probably all you need to know, is that he was a famous cattleman and had had a trail named after him, right, for his business, his success in business. Another name, another famous name, Richard King. He owned the King Ranch, which is way down here in South Texas, okay? I'm just going to kind of circle it because it's, I don't know if it's that big, but it's big. It was a big ranch, huge ranch, largest ranch in Texas, maybe in the U.S., I don't know, but a big ranch, 1 million acres or so, and another big name in the cattle industry. Oh, man, my nose. Now, another name that's in the teaks that you'll want to be aware of is Lizzie Johnson. Lizzie Johnson, make sure I got that right. Johnson, yes. Lizzie Johnson. Now, she was the first woman to drive her own cattle that had her own brand, on a cattle drive north to market. She was kind of based around Austin, and anyway, that's what she's known for, being the first woman to drive cattle under her own brand, drive herself with people who she hired to north to market. So those three names in the teaks, you might want to be aware of them. Okay, 1866 started after the Civil War. The markets opened up. Why did it close? Okay, 1896. Why was that the case? Well, it was a couple of reasons, but one big reason was barbed wire. Right, Joseph Glidden, he invented barbed wire in 1874, and so in 1874, ranchers could, well, starting then anyway, ranchers could fence off their land. And so while this land was largely open, right, in 1866, by 1896, it was, or right around there, it was not largely open anymore, right? So large cattle companies and really rich ranchers owned most of the, or a lot of the land, maybe not most, but a lot of the land through here, and then eventually they fenced it off. So they didn't have any land to drive cattle through. There wasn't this open land, right? Because they would hit a fence, okay? And that's kind of a problem if you're trying to drive cattle through there. Well, railroads took up the slack. So how did cows get to market? Well, they didn't have to drive them anymore because railroads expanded from just a little bit over here in the west, east, sorry, to a little bit. There's some images in one of your handouts about the spread of railroads, right? It started over here in the east, and it just spread, and eventually down here into Texas. So they didn't have to drive the cattle. They still had to move them, but not nearly as far, okay? They could drive them to somewhere else in Texas to put them on a train and take them to markets, as opposed to take them to Kansas, right? A long ways away to get to the railroad, right? Because that's what they were doing. They were taking them to the railroad, right? Various towns that had railheads, had railway stations, right? That was the issue. And by 1896, there were plenty of railroads and railroad stations. They could take the cattle, and it was closed off because of barbed wire, right? So that's what there is to know about cattle, about the cattle industry and the growth of the cattle industry at the end of the 19th century. The other thing we need to think about is frontier, relations with Native Americans. So I'm just going to put Native Americans. Okay, Native Americans. Well, there were two things to be aware of. Okay, two things. Most of the relations were bad. All right, so the U.S. government would make a treaty with Native American tribes and then eventually break the treaty, right? And usually it was the U.S. government breaking the treaty. Those are just the facts, right? There was one treaty, though. It wasn't signed by the U.S. government. It was signed by a German he was an immigrant, a German immigrant, a land prospector. Meusbach was his name, and he was bringing German settlers, right, from Germany that way to settle right around in this area in between the San Saba and the Llano River. And it was kind of in here. You can't see it on this map, but kind of in there. All right, I'll just kind of shade it, kind of there. And this treaty was called the Muse-bach-comanche Treaty. All right, so this was a positive thing, right? But an arrow for, you know, a positive thing. I guess I put a happy face on there. That's what I'll do. I'll put a happy face. So the Muse-bach-comanche Treaty. Okay, so why is that a happy face? Well, it was happy because it was peaceful for everybody involved. It was peaceful for the German immigrants. It was peaceful for the Comanche, and for a time, everyone lived in, you know, kind of harmony there, right? It was signed in 1847. Okay, 1847. It was never broken. It wasn't broken by the German settlers. It wasn't broken by the Comanche. It allowed for both sides, both groups in this area to live. Okay, it established a little bit of commerce and established some rights for both groups. And 4,000 German settlers came and settled in that area, and that's why it's well known. The Muse-bach-comanche Treaty. It's in the Texes. Maybe it'll be on your test. I don't know, but that's what it is. Now, the other events during this time, we're talking about the end of the 1800s. Well, they weren't. At least they weren't happy for the Native Americans. Okay, so sad face there for the Native Americans. They weren't happy. Okay, and we're talking about the frontier wars. Okay, that's what we're talking about. After the Civil War, the U.S. Army started to fight Native Americans. There was a lot of conflict, at least in Texas. There was a lot of conflict. We're talking about North Texas here. I'll get rid of those lines so you can see this. Talking about North Texas and kind of that area, right up here in the Panhandle. And eventually, there were some details that you're not going to get asked about, but eventually U.S. Army troops fought Native American tribes, warriors from a variety of different groups, from Kiowa and Comanche and Cheyenne and Arapaho, a number of different groups. And they pushed, this was 1874, all right? So let's call it the well, it's the Frontier Wars, but it's the Red River War is what it was called, 1874, okay? 1874, and they were trying to push Native Americans out of Texas, right? Well, at least up here, entirely, and into Oklahoma. Okay, it became policy by the U.S. government eventually to force Native Americans to live on reservations, and this was one effort to push Native Americans into Oklahoma, and there were reservations in Oklahoma. Anyway, we don't have to get into the politics of that. Of Native American relocation, right? Their forced removal, okay? But it really shaped Texas, right? It really shaped Texas. So let's think of the year, okay? 1874, here, 1866. What was another reason why all these cattle, going back to cattle, because there's a connection here, all these cattle could just go north right through there? Well, by 1874, all the Native Americans have been pushed out, right? Now, so let's not worry about the Comanche and the Muse-bach Treaty. That one, the details you're not going to get asked about. You know, were they pushed out? You're not going to get asked about that. Don't worry about that. But just right around, just to the left of that, right? Just to the west. And up here, all the Native Americans have been pushed out. Well, on empty space. But those cattle right on through. Okay, so there is a connection there. Okay, so hopefully you'll see that. And one other tactic that's in the Texes that had to do with moving Native Americans out of Texas was that the government would hire, you've probably seen this in the movies, Dances with Wolves comes to mind, right, where Costner sees all the buffalo and they're all killed, right? Anyway, there's plenty of other films and shows that show that. They would hire people to just go around and shoot buffalo and bison, right? to shoot them, kill them, and to kill the food supply, the main food supply for various Native American groups, and it just caused a lot of problems, decimated them, and really hurt them. So that's in your teaks too, okay? So that is cattle, that's Native American relations, okay? Meusbach-Comanche Treaty and the Red River War, all right? The other thing that you might get asked about is the oil industry, okay? Oil, okay? The other thing that you might get asked about is the oil industry. And we're talking about Spindletop. Spindletop started the oil industry, it really did, in Texas and in the U.S. It was 1901, Spindletop, so we're talking Spindletop, 1901, January 10th, 1901, outside of Beaumont, right over here. Spindletop, that's where it was. It was an oil well, and when it blew, it was the biggest oil well in the history of the U.S. At the time. It was the biggest oil well. It was bigger than all the other oil wells in the U.S. combined. It was so big. It was owned by a man named Patio, I'm going to get that wrong probably, Higgins. He's in the teaks. All right, I don't know if you'll be asked about it, but Patio Higgins owns Spindletop. And the location, it's over here in Beaumont. It might that might be in the teaks. I don't know. And before Spindletop, the thinking about oil and petroleum was at least in terms of the uses, was kind of small. It was everyday stuff, meaning like lighting lamps and stuff like that. It wasn't industry. It wasn't this massive thing that oil and gas is now that drives the economy in so many places. I mean, in Texas especially, drives the economy. Well, Spindletop changed that thinking. Okay, before Spindletop, it was pretty small. The thinking about it. Then after Spindletop, it was huge. Spindletop increased the size of populations, of course. Beaumont went from 9,000 people to about 30,000 people very quickly. Houston Ship Channel was built or dug or established in 1914, so not too long after that, of course, and this area just became this huge oil and gas center, right? Still is today, of course, right? Still is today, and all that started with Spindletop, okay? And that's probably what you need to know if you're going to get asked about that. The effect of Spindletop on the economy. It helped the auto industry, right? Because now there's all this oil for refining into gasoline that didn't exist before, but it exists now. Not too long after that, Henry Ford's building lots and lots up here in Michigan. He's building lots and lots of automobiles and GM and so forth. So it drove the auto industry. It drove eventually all kinds of industries, right? It all started with Spindletop. Okay, so these are the three big areas that you ought to keep in mind for your test. Cattle, Native Americans, and oil and Spindletop, and these are the details that are listed in the teak. So keep those things in mind, and hopefully it'll help you.